It's my distinct privilege today to kick off the afternoon session at the Fragility Forum with a session that's titled Global Action on Climate Change and Fragility. Where are we? Where should we be? Let me start off by just framing this very briefly. We had great achievements last year, Paris, SDGs, but the reality is, as the emissions gap analysis has demonstrated, that even if all the NDCs are met, we're still looking at an emissions gap of at least 11 gigaton CO2 equivalents, and the temperature track is on track to rise to at least 3 degrees by 2030. So that's the context of where we are. The WEF, the World Economic Forum, in its Global Risks Report, has indicated in terms of the top risk in terms of impact is the failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation. So according to the WEF, that's the #1 global risk in terms of impact. It's the third one in terms of likelihood, but the other two top risks, which are large-scale involuntary migration and extreme weather events, are obviously also related to the failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation. So the top global risks are what we are talking about today. Now, with one of the frameworks that we adopted last year was the SDGs, and only one of them focuses on climate change. But I think it's fair to say that the delivery of the entire SDG framework, of the new International Agenda for Development, will rest and will be contingent on our success on dealing with the linkages of climate change mitigation and adaptation. Not just in terms of delivering, but of avoiding the hard-won development gains that we've achieved over the past decades. I like to say that we are very good about tackling today's poverty, and we know what we're doing there, but we're perhaps not as good about thinking about how we avoid creating conditions for tomorrow's poverty. And that's also what this conversation about climate change and fragility is about. I would like to flag, and I know that this was said today, but I think it's important to emphasize again that this is not only a situation that affects fragile states. Certainly, they face very daunting and complex development challenges exacerbated by climate change, which is such a threat multiplier. But it's equally important for countries such as my own, Colombia, to also understand and to look at how these recurrent impacts and growing impacts are really limiting growth and development options. One of the aspects that I think is important and that keeps me up at night is what I call the short-termism. Everything we're going to be talking about, everything this panel is addressing, requires a long-term breadth and a long-term perspective, the kind of political commitment that goes beyond electoral or political or budget cycles. And as human beings, we're just not very well wired to think about the long term. So that's one of the issues that I would invite the panel to think about. These are complex issues, and I think we're very privileged today to have 3 of the 4 lead authors, as well as a leading researcher that worked on this report that was commissioned by the G77 in 2015, which is A New Climate for Peace, and it looks at the relationship between climate change and fragility. It has 5 action areas: global risk assessment, food security, disaster risk reduction, transboundary water disputes, and building local resilience. Certainly very salient areas that I'm sure our panelists will talk about. So without further introduction, let me turn to the panel and introduce them so that we can start off the session. In the middle, I think, I have Dan Smith, who's the director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. He has served on the UN Peacebuilding Fund Advisory Group, and as you all know, he is a renowned scholar. He is a professor of peace and conflict at the University of Manchester since January of 2014. He's the author of successive editions of Atlases of Politics, War, and Peace, with a special focus on the Middle East, and blogs on international politics. We have Janani Vivekananda, who is the head of Environment, Climate Change, and Security at International Alert. And I practiced her name, so I hope this time I got it right, where she's responsible for research and implementation support on climate change, environmental and natural resource-related dimensions of peace building and security. Since 2006, she has been working on climate change and security issues and published widely on the subject, including on the implications of climate change policies on peace and the links between environmental change and disasters. Seated further afield is Lucas Rutiger. He's a senior project manager at Adelphi, where he focuses on the links between environmental change and conflict. Lucas has worked on the security implications of climate change for many international organizations, such as the UN, the European Commission, and the German Foreign Ministry, and is one of the lead authors, together with Janani and Dan, of the report. And finally, we have Malin Mobjork, whose last name I'm sure I have just tangled horribly, who's a senior researcher at CPRI. Her research focuses on security challenges posed by climate and environment change, risk analysis of dynamic and complex issues, and the development of adequate responses to the complexity of climate-related security risks. Malin is also a member of the Swedish Expert Group for AIDS Studies, EBA. So with that, let me briefly tell you what the format will be. There will be 4 presentations by each of the panelists, followed by a round of Q&As. There's microphones in the middle of the room, and when we finish the presentations, I would ask those of you who have questions to line up with the microphones. I'm hoping we can do sort of 2 rounds of questions so we give the panelists a chance to respond. So with that, I would like to hand it over to you, Dan.
Yes, thank you very much, Paula, and I'm glad to be here. I'm glad we were able to set this session up. The G7 report, of which I also have a copy here, A New Climate for Peace, was commissioned by the G7 in the wake of a decision taken by the foreign ministers meeting that really sort of set out that climate change is, yes, a natural issue, an environmental issue. It is also a development issue, and it is also a security issue. And I suppose that one of the things you could say is that, yes, at the time, a couple of years back, it was understood to be a security issue, but what did that mean? And so the officials of the G7 meeting in the months after that foreign ministers meeting decided to convene a group of think tanks and NGOs to really explain or to set out what is the state of the present knowledge on the security challenges that are posed by climate change and its impacts. And I think the first thing which I want to say before going on to say how we answered that question is to say something about how we didn't answer it, something that we steered well away from saying. It is not the conclusion, indeed it's not the starting point of this report, that climate change causes or will cause armed conflicts. To make such a statement is to grossly oversimplify the way in which armed conflicts come about. It is to narrow the field of study from insecurity as a whole to just one form of insecurity, which is armed conflict. And it leads to all kinds of other distortions in the debate, which we've been spending years of our lives discussing, and I don't want to bore you with any further now. But the point is that to think of climate change as a single cause, which has this effect or might have this effect of causing an armed conflict, is to misunderstand almost everything about how and why people sometimes take the extreme decision to go into violent conflict with each other. So what are the risks? Our starting point was to understand that there are the risks of instability, insecurity, and including armed conflict are at their greatest where different problems are clustering together and where the impact of these different issues is all felt at once in a combined way. Thus, for example, gross inequality with pockets of deep poverty in a context of bad governance in the aftermath of armed conflict, where the natural environment is deteriorating, and you're, with every additional phrase you throw in there, you're reflecting an increased risk of insecurity and violent conflict. So we focused our attention onto 7 risk clusters, as we call them. And the first one is to do with the pressure on natural resources and especially the local impact of that. And one of the relatively little discussed consequences of climate change is actually that the competition for natural resources, where they are relatively straightforward to get access to, heats up. And the greatest impact of that competition, where if and when it's going to be negative, will not be felt so much in the relation between the extractive states. It'll be felt in the reality on the ground in places like Eastern Congo and so on. The second one is livelihood insecurity, in a variety of different ways, but especially via the transmission mechanism of water insecurity and also food insecurity. Climate change is having an impact in different localities around the world, making livelihoods less secure. And one of the consequences of people being less able to secure their livelihood in a given place is that they move to another one. Now, I think that, quite honestly, an awful lot that is misleading has been said about migration as a consequence of climate change. Most of the migration that ensues from climate change will be, as most migration is today, within a country rather than internationally. And if it crosses borders, crossing borders quite locally, right? I think it's about 200 million people, 210 million people today live outside the country of their birth, but something like 3.5 to 4 times that number live within the country of their birth, but in a completely different region. And it's that kind of migration, plus also temporary labor migration, which may ensue from climate change. For the places that receive those migrants, nonetheless, even if it's not international, that can be a serious issue. And depending on how it's handled, that can be a question creating or generating insecurity and instability. The third area is to do with the weather, extreme weather events. When an extreme weather event hits an unprepared society or community, then it becomes a natural disaster. Natural disasters happen. How well the recovery from natural disaster happens often gets tied up into issues of poor governance, unequal provision, unequal access, and thus into grievance and fodder for conflict. The fourth area is volatile food prices. If you want an example of how volatile food prices can lead to insecurity and instability, the classic example in my view is Egypt in 2011, where part of the background to that was the impact on food prices of drought in Russia, of forest fires in Russia and Ukraine, and drought in China, and also unfavorable weather conditions in both Canada and Australia. That doubled the price of wheat on the global market, and Egypt is the world's largest wheat importer. Basic need was part of what lay behind Tahrir Square. The fifth area is transboundary water management. Now, this is an area where people have often said, you know, the next wars are not going to be about oil, they'll be about water. And the comeback to that is, yes, but they haven't been. We've got pretty good records going back several hundred years, and mostly shared water resources, almost exclusively, in fact, shared water resources lead to cooperation rather than to open conflict. But a lot of the agreements which there are at the moment that manage shared water resources are based on volume of water flow. They're not based on a percentage share, they're based on the volume. And if the total volume declines, then neither party, no party to that agreement, will get the share which they're supposed to get under the treaty. So those agreements start to be at risk. I think this is a fixable area, but it's certainly an important one. The sixth area is sea level rise and the effect of coastal degradation. Somebody else has undoubtedly got the statistic in my head. Is it that 75% of the world's major cities are within 3 miles of a coastline? Something like that. So this is not just an issue about, you know, rural coastline areas disappearing, loss of beautiful coastline. It's about the impact upon people's lives in cities where governance is poor, where again you have high inequalities. And the last area which we outlined is the unintended risk of policies that are meant to address climate change, of which the classic example is the biofuels case, where the European Union wanted to increase biofuel use, So biofuel production was increased, which meant taking land away from people in Indonesia, and it's thought that it actually tipped some 30 million people into poverty as a direct result of that, and also violent conflicts ensued. So I've gone galloping through those areas as fast as I can, but the thing basically to keep your eye on is that each area that I'm talking about is itself a cluster where different factors are coming into play. And I suppose the key thing you could say about all of this is that what matters is not just the severity of the problem, but the adequacy of the response. And if the government institutions or the international or the local institutions are not able to respond in a way which looks after the well-being of ordinary people properly, then there are severe problems which could include insecurity and, in the end, violent conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I will now turn to Janani for the next session. She'll elaborate on global processes and how conflict and climate change does or does not feature in all these post-2015 and 2015 agreements.
Great, thanks, Paula. So Dan's very comprehensively outlined the risk, and I'd like to talk a bit about how these risks, these compound risks, feature in the somewhat sectoral global processes. As you'll know, 2015 was a landmark year for global agreements across climate change, across disasters, and the development sectors. We saw, as Paula mentioned, the Paris Protocol coming out in December 2015, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Sustainable Development Goals, and then looking forward to this year, we've got the World Humanitarian Summit in May. But despite these potentially paradigm-shifting agreements, these new frameworks for dealing with conflict, for disasters and climate change still run in parallel. The explicit linkages between the different types of risks and vulnerabilities that Dan touched upon are still missing. To go into this in a little bit more detail, starting with Paris, the security implications of climate change were actually picked up in the run-up to the COP. The policymakers involved in the G7 championed this under this Climate and Security Initiative under the British presidency and the German presidency. And the British, French, Germans and the USA used climate security issues to garner greater political support for an ambitious global deal in the run-up to the COP. However, the UNFCCC mandate doesn't address conflict or fragility, and so it wasn't part of the negotiations, and of course it wasn't part of the final agreement. But that's not to say that adaptation and mitigation don't play a role in, or rather conflict and peace building don't play a role in meeting these adaptation and mitigation targets. They absolutely do, and I'll touch on this a bit later. The Sendai Framework, it was coming on the back of 10 years of implementing the Hyogo Framework for Action, and it sets out a new 15-year pathway for working on disasters globally. And yet, despite some really strong recognition within the disaster risk reduction community around the links between conflict and disasters and climate change, and in fact, explicit recognition of these linkages in all the preparatory documents in the lead-up to the conference, the final reference to conflict was actually negotiated out of the final text in Japan at the 11th hour, which was an incredible missed opportunity. The Sustainable Development Goals, now climate and fragility are covered within the new framework, but they are not explicitly addressed together. Most of the goals have a sectoral focus, water, health, education, etc., or they focus on a particular dimension of sustainability, such as economic or environmental, but they're not looking at these the links between these dimensions of sustainability. So we've got as entry points SDG 13, which talks about tackling climate change and its impacts, and 16, which is critical to this discussion around building peaceful and inclusive societies. And they are entry points, but they lack the weight of emphasis required on the connections between the risks of conflict, climate change, and disasters. And the challenge is going to be then to effectively link programming across these two goals. And then the World Humanitarian Summit. This is perhaps the most pivotal current process in which climate change and security risks are addressed, or need to be addressed jointly. The whole process came about in acknowledgement of the fact that the current humanitarian system is not fit for purpose. It's not able to cope with the increasingly complex humanitarian crises that we're facing. And so explicit recognition of these links are critical if we're to see this paradigm shift that people are talking about in the humanitarian arena. What does this mean then, and why is it so important? Well, obviously the lack of joined up policy, joined up linkages across these sectors in the policy frameworks inhibit joined up policy. And as we know from trying to meet the Millennium Development Goals, or even 5 decades of development practice, lack of joined up policy makes it that much harder to do joined up operational kind of responses to these issues on the ground. And then the other issue is around funding. According to the Global Humanitarian Assistance Report from last year, we reached, for a second year running, the peak in global in spending on humanitarian assistance. I think it was $24.5 billion. And yet still, this wasn't enough to meet the demand for humanitarian assistance. So it's unlikely that we're going to find more and more money to meet the growing humanitarian needs. So we need to be able to use what we have more efficiently, and this means joined up responses that can really capitalize on the co-benefits of addressing these compound risks. Very quickly, a couple of entry points. It's not entirely negative. Remaining on funding, although it's outside the UNFCCC's mandate, climate responses provide clear entry points for managing climate and fragility risks and building resilience. At the same time, though, as more money and efforts are being put towards climate change, adaptation and mitigation, in many cases in fragile states, the risk of unintended negative consequences also increase if they're not done in a way that is aware of the complex social, political and economic factors at play, the fragility and conflict dynamics in a particular context. So there's a real risk, as Dan mentioned, that these well-intentioned policies can actually undermine economic development and contribute to political instability and potentially increase the risk of conflict. The concept of resilience has also been somewhat helpful in bringing people together around the idea of interconnectivity, and a lot of donors and practitioners have kind of harnessed this concept and it's become quite central to programming, but the real challenge now is to ensure that we move from this conceptual, theoretical understanding of the concept to translating this into practice. The SDGs, I think there is some scope, or at least there needs to be if we are to meet any of the goals. It's not going to be possible to bring about this shift, this paradigmatical shift in sustainable development unless the interconnections between disasters, conflict and fragility are met. And then the World Humanitarian Summit. Now I think the WHS has got right what some of the other processes have not, and that is the links, the connections between disasters, conflict and climate change. Now we desperately need a new humanitarian approach that enables linked responses to these linked risks. And potentially, whilst it might not be the silver bullet, the process of the World Humanitarian Summit can maybe provide the impetus and work as a catalyst to bring about some kind of a change in how we do things on the ground.
Thank you very much. We'll go straight then to the next speaker, and Lucas will talk about what's happening in practice, experiences and entry points to do exactly what Janini was talking about the need to do.
Thank you. Yeah, and maybe connecting to what Dan said in the beginning, I mean, we're now at a point where our science and knowledge is robust enough to verify that there are links between climate change and fragility. They are complex and they're not easy, but we can understand them and we can now identify certain dynamics, and that's what we have done. And these are the aforementioned climate fragility risks, the compound risks. And maybe most importantly, we also have now very convincing examples for policymakers to make them aware of those risks. For example, the links between the drought in Syria and the conflict today. So we are very good at the level of the risk narrative at the moment. But now to address these climate fragility risks on the ground, the key challenge is how do we effectively link climate change adaptation, peace building, humanitarian assistance, and development. And the goal is really here to realize co-benefits and synergies, and as Janani said, to avoid unintended negative impacts, and then really build resilience against a whole range of shocks and stressors, not only conflict, because like Dan said, the compound risks emerge there where different stressors come together. So it's not enough to just build resilience against climate change or just against conflict if you have these systemic risks. And we have the first examples now on the ground that show that these co-benefits really exist. So one well-documented and well-researched example are Mercy Corps' peace centers in East Africa that were a peace-building program, but that showed that the communities which got the assistance were not only better to withstand conflicts or were better at conflict management, but also better to cope with the drought that happened in the region. So first examples. And a good starting point from there, of course, is to do to make sure that climate change adaptation and mitigation projects are conflict sensitive. And so we're already having an emerging field of conflict-sensitive climate adaptation, but we're really there in the beginning, so we're missing a lot of experiences and guidance. I'm only aware that one major donor has some guidance document, USAID, on how to do peace building and climate change adaptation together. And the problem is, as you all know, if you want to do this kind of mainstreaming approach, if you don't have experiences or can show tangible benefits, it's almost impossible to convince somebody that they should do mainstreaming like that. And then, of course, mainstreaming in itself has its limitations. So what we really need is projects that integrate that on a deeper level, that bring these different dimensions together in a more holistic way, and that brings me back to my original point of saying, okay, we have a convincing risk narrative. What we now kind of need is a solution narrative on how to address these systemic risks. And I want to give one very practical example of how a project like that can look like. We'll start working with UNEP in about a month on a project that tries to bring together peace building and climate change adaptation from the beginning, and that goes well beyond conflict sensitivity and really tries to have development, peace building, and climate change adaptation results. And the starting point for that project is an existing gap in the system. It's on the assessment level. So what we have right now on the kind of methodological side, we have vulnerability assessments, which often don't really look at the socioeconomic dimensions. Maybe a little, but not too much. And then on the other hand, we have peace and conflict assessments or fragility assessments, and they don't look at long-term trends like climate change or environmental change. So what we're trying to do with this project, bringing these methodologies together, and then based on a first assessment in pilot countries, design pilot interventions that really hopefully contribute to provide some experiences and examples of how climate change adaptation, peace building and development can be done together and effectively linked to provide more of a solution narrative. And the project will have a duration of 4 years. It's financed through the European Commission and their instrument contributing to stability and peace. And that brings me back to one last point that was already mentioned, to financing. And I think the instrument contributing to stability and peace is a good example because it's a peace-building instrument, but it has earmarked funding for climate change adaptation projects. Just a really minute amount of the 2 billion the European Commission is spending, but it's a good example of what needs to be scaled up. Because if you have these financing instruments that kind of are cross-sectoral and that understand resilience a little bit broader, then you have projects, and then you can build these kind of experiences that you can then scale up.
Thank you very much. We'll move then to the last speaker, who will talk about the emerging lessons from the CETA study on donor take-up of climate conflict risk, this nexus.
Thank you. And I will elaborate a little bit further on similar issues as Lucas raised. It's also from this more practical experience when you have this general understanding of the need for an integrated approach, that there are complex risks which the organization needs to manage, and the strength is more collaboration and partnership. It also how to work with them more from a practical side. And in the study which we are conducting, it's funded by the Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs. We both look into this more climate-related change, conflict dimension to increase the understanding under the circumstances, climate change, climate-related security risks are related to violent conflict, because that is also a way of informing the policy making to understand this more complex relationship. The second part relates to how organization in Europe, in this first section of the study, we are focused on European organization, development organization. And you see it very evident that development organization, we are looking into the UK, Germany, Netherlands, and Sweden. They really take on the security discourse agenda in their organization, which is relating back to how this whole field of climate change and security had changed during the last decade. They're also taking up the need for partnership, for integrated approaches, overcoming silos, bridge building approaches. But at the same time, this is a search how to do it, how to set up the organizations. And to just give a few examples of what we are seeing in this study, it is that they are trying to find a balance between how to mainstreaming, because it is to all programs should be climate-proof, made conflict analysis based in the programs. That is resource demanding and not always relevant in every program. On the other hand, if it's going to be just in specific way, how to select those, how to find ways of finding those programs which should be have this integrated approach, including both climate and conflict dimension in their programs. And they are searching and finding and trying a way, and I think this experience sharing is important to move it forward. For instance, if they have a mainstreaming approach, they have set up a special unit guiding this, but then the mainstream approach is taken away. The special unit for guiding the analysis is also taken away, which makes it maybe more difficult, at least from some of the interviews we have been made, to have the expertise guiding when it should be integrated. Another aspect focused more, what we have figured out is how to work with more boundary crossing between departments in the government. There, for instance, in the UK, they set up a unit, a department unit crossing the FID, FCO, and MOD, and also that they have developed a cross-department conflict analysis work. This is not specifically addressing climate-related security risk, but it is a way trying to work more cross-department in the way to approaching the issues. And I think that just to mark some remarks which could be important to what we can learn from this is this finding this balance of making short-term issues with the long-term aspects, but also the mainstreaming, the support unit, the need of expertise in order to guide when to do it and how to do it. And then, of course, this is on a policy agenda setting level, then you need to work from a practical settings and combine what is possible to do on the practical grounds, because even if you have on the policy level, you have included it on your analysis and the program set up, it must also be able to work on it from a practical settings. And therefore, it also needs to be balanced with the possibility for those on the practical side to work with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very insightful and very complimentary set of interventions. What I'm taking away from this before we open up for questions, and I'd like to remind those of you who would want to ask questions, if you can please prepare your questions and maybe line up with the microphones in the middle of the room, and then we'll take the questions in order. Dan stressed the fact that these are compound risks to which climate change is really not necessarily a driver, but a multiplier, a threat multiplier of these compound risks. One of the key aspects that I would like to highlight that is important is that what is really the determining factor is not just the severity of the hazard of the risk, but the adequacy of the response. And here we have Malin talking about the challenges from a donor perspective, and these are very well-structured and functional departments. So it really enables you to think about what are the challenges that you're looking at in terms of adequacy of response when you're looking at states that have much weaker capacity, perhaps slightly dysfunctional institutional setups, and you're now being able or being requested to rejig your entire institutional setup to be able to respond to these threats, to these development challenges in a more integrated and comprehensive way through integrated assessments, integrated risk analysis, et cetera, et cetera. So this really speaks to, I think, the challenges that we're going to have ahead on organizations like the World Bank and donors and organizations like CIPRI to really crack the nut about how this is done on the ground. Now, you were talking about what I would say proof of concept in a way. You know, what is the narrative, the solution narrative that is needed? How I would put it, perhaps in World Bank terms, is how do you make the business case that this actually makes sense? Because clearly hasn't percolated yet, as Janani was showing us, at the international sphere. These are all discussions about the same set of issues, and yet we end up with very different frameworks that don't necessarily address the same issues. The SDGs were crafted and really created with the sense of the need to bring together the different tenets and the different factors that influence development, but we still ended up with 17 goals. And they are unlikely to be implemented in an integrated way unless we can make the case for that too. So we're really looking, I think we have a good sense of the framing of the problem. One of the challenges ahead is how we actually unpack that at all levels, particularly dealing with fragile states, but as I said at the beginning, how we also support middle-income countries and even developed countries that are starting to look at challenges with droughts, with depleted groundwater, et cetera, and what that means. So with these few reflections, I'd really like to, I don't see anybody lining up, so please don't be shy. It's a privilege to have, okay, we have our first taker. Can you deal with, okay, so the microphone's on. So please, I would ask those of you asking questions to introduce yourselves, and we'll take a first round of questions and then turn it to the panel.
My name's Ein Christopoulos. I'm with the Danish Institute for International Studies and the Swedish consulting firm Seed in Develop. My question is about the points just raised about how to move within the development cooperation bureaucracies we have towards this more complex, flexible approach of dealing with multiple risks. In my work, I've found that even if people on an intellectual level agree to this, they recognize that there are examples of good practice, the incentive structures are completely different, and they haven't changed, and in some ways are going in the opposite direction. There's a strong belief now that we should trust simple results frameworks. We should focus on using random control trials for defining our objectives, and they, as we know, can only deal with one or two variables and not these multiple variables. To ask Malin, Ebba has been very strong in promoting RCTs in Sweden as the way forward. We're also, locked in the old normal around sustainability. Ebba also has a review underway of sustainability that focuses on seeing that as about stability, about normalcy, about linear development. How do we break out of that and move towards the new normal of uncertainty, repeated crises, and resilience when our incentive structures and development agencies are going in the other direction?
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for the panel discussion. It's very interesting. My name is Patricia Strong. I'm from the Canadian Red Cross, and I'd like to hear a little more about where you're thinking the issue of health fits into this discussion, because it is both the consequences of climate change for health are certainly potentially enormous, and their relationship to fragility, I think, is certainly in the minds of some of us who work in the field are quite clear, both with looking at the more, I guess probably the more acute examples of epidemics, but health is a factor which contributes to inequality, is experienced unequally and equitably, and contributes to inequality. And there would be a linkage between climate change and health. So I'd just like to hear a little bit more about your thinking on this. Thank you.
Hi, my name is James Cox. I'm with a very, very new NGO called Pacifica, which focuses on peace and conflict issues in the Pacific region. And a couple of weeks ago, I was at a conference looking at climate change issues in the Pacific, which was being held in New Zealand. And what was described at that conference was at least 5 of the risk factors that Dan outlined in his presentation, which are happening in the Pacific region right now. And on the one hand, obviously there's a clear need there for continued forms of concerted action now, and I don't think they're really looking at the climate risks the conflict risks all that closely at present. But I guess more generally is wondering whether action there now to address these risks can be used as part of the getting the world ready for larger scale global responses. They're small in global terms, but what lessons can that offer for the rest of the world as we respond?
My name is Enos Eskuri with the World Bank, Environment and Natural Resources Global Practice. Thanks for the presentations. I have 2 questions. One, I would like to hear your thoughts on the role of data, information, and knowledge in terms of how we address risks at the national level. A lot of the countries that are highly vulnerable, some of them in fact in conflict, have a major issue when it comes to data. So what would be the critical things that a national level planner would need to have to make decisions? Because we really don't have time to bring them up to speed in terms of comprehensive data sets that will help them to make right decisions at the national level in terms of climate risk and conflict at the national level, but also at the local level. Second is on the resourcing. As we had, the adequacy of the response will depend obviously on capacity and available resources. We also had earlier that 80% of the resources available for humanitarian and conflict-related disasters is going towards prevention of armed conflict. And up to now, we still tend to address climate-related disasters in a crisis mode. When there's a hurricane, then we rush there and put some money there. How do we change this dynamic so that we upstream it towards a risk management, resource allocation, and approach?
Thank you. I'm of 2 minds whether we take another round of questions. I'm just wondering how many. Why don't I suggest something in the interest of time, because we have about 10 minutes. Why don't we take another question, and then I'll turn it over to the panel, and maybe I'm not sure we're going to have time for a second round of questions. And I can ask the panelists also to reflect on some of your key messages or key take-homes. So why don't you step up, sir, and we'll take another question.
Thanks, panel. My name is Mark Robinson. I direct the Governance Centre at the World Resources Institute. I'd like to join this conversation to some other conversations happening around the forum in relation to sequencing of peace building and state building in post-conflict states. And that was signaled, obviously, as one part of the most critical part of the spectrum that the speakers addressed. In particular, and it links to the last point around capacity, do any of you have some good examples of where in a post-conflict environment the state and its local representatives, almost the street-level bureaucrats for climate action, have been equipped with the understanding, the wherewithal, both to manage the range of risks you outlined, some of which might be climate-related, some of which are not, because the risk of overburdening these very sometimes undercapacitated, unresourced officials is immense in view of the range of expectations placed upon them to be able to engage and respond effectively. So any insights you might have on some good examples of where this has worked would be immensely helpful. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we have a pretty rich and robust set of questions. Perhaps do you have does the panel have a preference on how you take it up? Why don't we start over there and we go backwards on the questions, and we'll end with you, Dan.
Shall I?
Please start.
Yeah, okay. I will take on a little bit on the first one about the incentives, which I think is extremely important, how to increase the incentives, because I share a little bit of this more not that positive idea when meeting a lot from officials in the organization, in the bureaucratic organization. I will try to look at it on the positive side. I think there are a moment of change in general, that there are really a much more profound understanding of the importance to work with these kind of issues and with the complex risks we are facing. So I think that is important for both, on the both hand, the political leadership that really needs to show that this is important and try to work with it in the multiple ways. Financing, organization, how we pointed out, there are directions for agencies to work on, but then also on the organizational leaders, which I think was rather obvious this morning, and take on how important it is to really try to work with this, and maybe an understanding that inactions also are actions, that you really need to break with that, trying with a much more trying has a possibility to try to make projects and revise them and trying again better, and this knowledge sharing. I think that is a very important way. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I would reiterate that. I mean, a lot of the outreach we've done with the report, and we've been talking a lot to policymakers within the G7, and especially the foreign ministries, that they tell us that they are also within the foreign offices, the capacity to deal with multiple crises is really limited, and they are already at their limit. And I think they're feeling it, and they feel the need to change their ministries and the structures around it. I think it's going slow, but I think it's going in the right direction. And I think there is an awareness of saying we can't just deal with the acute crisis, or we'll be overwhelmed tomorrow with the crisis of tomorrow. And they understand that the crises of today are the warning signs of what is coming tomorrow. So I think that is, as I said before, I think they are quite clear on the risk narrative, but on the solution side, it's still lacking. But I think it is really the key is to look for the levers in the system and to look for those incentive structures, to see what kind of financing instruments do we actually need, and do we have financing instruments that actually allow cross-sectoral spending? Are budgets organized along sectors, or do they actually allow for cross-sectoral programming? And I think that's very important. And then to never underestimate the management level. I mean, I think this morning I thought it was quite interesting, some of the keynotes, how far they went in saying, like, in trying to giving that direction also within the World Bank, you need to cooperate. And I think that has to trickle down really into the country level, that it is for the managers in the countries a real priority to have this cross-sectoral approaches. And I would say that mainstreaming is not enough. If we take these kind of risks serious enough, it's not just it can't be, our answer can't be, oh, we have the existing institutions, we just mainstream it within those institutions. We really have to change some of the things or some of or how we approach these kind of systemic risks. And that brings me to the potential as well, and kind of the question that went down really to the local level of saying, or two questions of saying, like, is there actually data for that? And how do we deal with not enough capacities on the local level to deal with multiple risks? And I think there, these broader resilience approaches, or also climate change adaptation, if you really understand it, of what it actually means are a great potential of bringing people together, of bringing decision makers together, and do that analysis together, and understand what the limits are within the data, because you always have limits in the data. Even in Germany, I mean, we've done that work also in Germany on the level, on the vulnerability network, bringing German agencies together. They also don't have all the data on drought, on so many things. But you have to bring those agencies together, understand what is the data, and then take the qualitative decisions together that form the basis for strategy making. Because there are always qualitative decisions. I think from the outside, sometimes if you think about climate change adaptation, or if you would just have the perfect vulnerability assessment and all the data, it's never like that. You never have all the data. So you just have to bring the right people together, do it in an inclusive way, and that's also the potential of bringing people together to devise these kind of strategies, and then it can really be simple again. It doesn't have to be a super complex program that tries to do everything at the same time, but it might be really a very focused intervention, but that focuses on 2-3 things that people can decide on. These are the key factors for resilience within a given local context.
Yes, I think in the absence of data, I think we can spend a lot of time striving to get perfect information, but as Lucas says, that may never come. And also, we can get climate data, but what we want to understand is not just the direct impacts of some of these climate risks, but also the knock-on consequences, these indirect, multiple level, complex pictures. So I think rather than trying to get fixated, or rather than being fixated on the hazard and getting as close to certainty as we can on the hazards that we're facing around climate change and natural disasters, another approach, at least in the short to medium run, is to look at some of the causes and drivers of vulnerability and start to address those as a way of building resilience. So if we take the example of livelihood insecurity, so climate change compounds the insecurity of people that are reliant on natural resources, such as farmers and herders and fishermen, etc. But there are also a bunch of other non-climate related factors which underlie this, this vulnerability. Things like unequal land distribution, insecure land tenure, unsustainable resource management practices, poorly developed markets, existing trade barriers, etc. These are all things we don't need climate data to be able to address. So I think there are a lot of entry points that we can identify as, as being components of vulnerability that we can address in our attempts to build resilience to a range of possible risk futures. Because I think trying to wait for the climate data, yes, it's great to have as much information as we can, but there's also a lot that we know and we can be addressing. Just a quick point on the issue of health. I think the climate impacts on health are quite well documented, the ways in which changes in temperature and rainfall are affecting food and nutrition and the range of diseases that are linked to this, but there's also an interesting issue around the allocation or access to health as a basic service which is affected by climate change. So climate change is compounding the demand for access to health, and if we look at a lot of fragile contexts, it's this lack of equity that just determines who's more vulnerable to climate change. Climate change might affect an entire community, but those that are most vulnerable will be the poorest and those that have the least access to health services. And we're actually doing some really interesting work in Lebanon, working with UNHCR around promoting access to health facilities that were designed for Syrian refugees, but also trying to encourage Lebanese communities to access these facilities too, because they're not exclusively for the refugees, but there's a perception and various cultural factors which inhibit cross-community usage of this facility. So we're trying to use access to health as a way to kind of build relationships and build social cohesion across these different affected groups.
Last but not least.
I think there's a couple of bits of kind of common wisdom that I could try to throw out and then distort wildly to make them applicable to the subject now. There's a couple of parallelisms within this field. One of them is that linked problems or compound problems require linked or compound solutions. I mean, if the issue resides in several different sectors, then the way that you address them needs to similarly reside in several different sectors. At the same time, and here comes the bit of sort of common wisdom, my mum always told me, you know, you're trying to run before you know how to walk. Slow down. And my reply when I was 7 years old, and it's still true now when I'm a little bit older, was, but I want to run. Right? And we need to run. The dilemma that we have is that we need to be able to do things that we're not able to do. And one of the things that we need to be doing is to be linking the solutions and the different approaches. We need to be able to work in the dark when we don't have full data and be able to adjust, and our systems make it hard for us to adjust. You raised the issue of the results agenda. Well, the thing about a results framework is that you define before you start the results which you're going to achieve. But what if as you go you learn more things about the problem and you adjust and you're flexible and you deal with it creatively? At the end of the day, the log frame manager comes in and says, but you didn't fulfill the project. Right? And we did some good, but we didn't fulfill the project. So these kinds of issues we need to be getting over. And at the same time, we have to figure out how these things work at very granular local level and how to take on some very big issues. So I think in some ways, the answer to this don't run before you can walk business is that we need to be moving as quickly as we can on a range of different fronts. And that will, over time, start to develop with fairly modest activities to begin with, probably, and already begun. That starts to develop a body of practice which we can draw on. So you mentioned the East Africa example. There's also some work which we researched together with UEA on the Niger Basin. And there are some good examples there of the sort of the cattle corridors being peacefully managed and the resources being properly shared at a time when they're coming under challenge, they're being restricted by climate change. The people who are doing this don't necessarily need to know that I am dealing with a compound risk that's partly the product of climate change. I'm dealing with a problem here on the ground. But we can see how that experience can be scaled up and generalized. Resourcing prevention. One of the things about natural disasters is that after a natural disaster, there's a recovery, because there has to be. That's why it happens, right? Prevention doesn't have to happen. That's all too often why it doesn't happen. I think that the fear I have, the nightmare scenario at the back of my mind, is that it will only be when they're in the wake of a genuine, serious, mega-scale disaster that the recognition will finally hit that, oh, we should be trying to prevent these things. Right? In some senses, being a bit ruthless about it, that's what issues in the Pacific might speak to other people in the world about. But surely we have to believe that we can get beyond that and that we can do better than that. And in that sense, the answer to the question of how do you make this move within the bureaucracy, I think in the end, you know, it's either a disaster or it's political leadership. And in the absence of political leadership, strong and clear and saying, get this stuff done, right? In the absence of that, we're not going to be making very much progress. Every time there's an injection of that fuel of political leadership into the machinery, it moves forward. Almost every piece of progress that we can see on this set of issues has been because somebody or some institution of leadership potential on a global scale has taken a step. Whether it's Ban Ki-moon with the climate summit, whether it's, I forget her name now, but who rescued the Cancun climate summit after Copenhagen. Yeah. Taking that kind of step and, stepping out there in front, exerting leadership and getting it done. That is what we are crying out for on this issue.
Well, thank you very much for, I think, what was a very insightful conversation. And thanks for the questions. I just have to add a few thoughts. I can't resist. One is that I don't think that a mega disaster will get people to act. I was a climate change negotiator for many years. We had Typhoon Haiyan, we had Sandy, we had Katrina, and we kept thinking that this is what's now it's going to happen, and the negotiations did not budge. So I don't think that's what does it. Yes, you need that political leadership, but it's not so easy to get there through a mega disaster. I think what we really need to do, and that's why this discussion is so rich today, is do more of this, is having practitioners from very different fields coming together to argue what are the costs of inaction and what are the costs of not linking up. Because that's one of the, if you will, the silver linings of climate change, or the silver linings of the refugee crisis, is that it's really focusing the mind on what happens when you don't. Because I know those of us who've been working in natural resource management for decades and trying to advance the cost of sustainable development, we've made very little headway because we bang our heads against the same silos, the inability to look at the externalities, the inability to tackle the trade-offs. That was the idea of the SDGs, was to create a framework that obliged everybody to come to the table and talk to each other. That won't happen if we still have the kinds of results frameworks that look at the water targets or the food security targets and don't realize that they're linked up. So I think it's these conversations that we have to have. We need that advocacy, and we need, from where I'm sitting in the bank, to really reach out, and I do this all the time. WRI, is you're sitting here, and many other organizations, so that we can really come together and have those compelling answers, compelling framing of the question, because it's not a question of mainstreaming. Mainstreaming won't get us anywhere. We have to reframe the problems. We have to understand the problems differently. And it's this kind of a forum and the kind of work that we're going to do before and after leading this kind of study that was really going to enable us to make the case to those who have to take decisions, and then you start to build up that political momentum. But time is short. I agree. There's a real sense of urgency. So my takeaway from this, Dan, is that we have to run. So thank you all very much, and thanks for a very insightful.
We have more copies of the report up here if you want to have a look at them. And then under www.newclimateforpeace.org, we also have a knowledge platform that has the results and a blog, and then also a fact book of case studies on climate fragility risks.